Welcome, JLF friends, and welcome, Katie Hickman. And I'm so happy because I chaired you for your last book last time at JIPO, and there's a really interesting narrative arc in your work that I can't wait to get stuck into. Do you want first off to introduce us to the new work?
Okay, well, it's a history of women in the American West. It's not a book about cowgirls. Everyone wants to go, yeehaw, when they hear the title.
I just did that, sorry. Couldn't help it.
No, it's good. It kind of gets us in the mood. It's the story of the opening up of the American West. In the mid-19th century, it was a series of journeys made across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, all the way to both Oregon and California. And the reason that I wrote it is because, our images of the West of America are so tied in with the Westerns that we saw when we were growing up. I mean, I think so many of us have that image, which is, these were the incredibly exciting stories that we all, I used to watch it, when television was still in black and white.
I mean, it sank into children's games of cowboys and Indians, so-called.
You watched them on a Sunday afternoon, and they were these incredibly gripping stories about outlaws and bank robbers and gold heists and all these things. And they were incredibly white and incredibly male. There were so few women in these stories. There were a few whores with a heart of gold, but that was about it. You would have thought the whole of the Wild West was only populated by white men and a few, quote unquote, savage, red Indians, as we used to call them in those days, who were always the enemy. So I have spent most of my writing career rescuing women's stories from oblivion. Women were there as well. Guess what? It's quite surprising because their stories never really seemed to come through. People thought that they weren't interesting enough or that their experiences were not sort of important enough to be written down and to be paid attention to. But the weird thing that I've only just really kind of started to realize myself, it's that the very reason that women's accounts, and there are many, surprisingly, the very reason that people thought that they weren't interesting enough to be, put in history books, shall we say, is because they tend to be very domestic. They tend to deal with very domestic detail. And of course, 150 years later, it's those domestic details, the absolute fabric of life.
There's some amazing research about it, and I want to come to that soon.
So
I
won't
hold back because I want to come to that because
that's
it's quite exceptional research.
That's the reason that I wanted to write a book about I'd say the Wild West. The Wild West is a Hollywood version, but the opening up of the American West through the eyes of these women's stories that no one had really paid that much attention to.
And you remark in your preface that you were actually surprised by some of your discoveries. It didn't go in the way that you anticipated necessarily. And almost, the reading of the book is almost akin to some of these journeys. It starts in a place of sort of naive curiosity. Oh, what's out there? Yes. And you end up in some really horrible places where terrible things are happening,
dark
much like
stories.
some of your protagonists.
Yes, dark stories.
Did you expect to be dealing with some of these extremities, which we'll get to?
I wasn't really quite sure what I was expecting. I think I thought I was going to write a book about the Wild West, but with some women in it. And actually, what I ended up writing was a story about this huge migration. So between 1840 and late 1860s, 500,000 people went west. Do you think this is a good time to show a map? Or
can we show a map?
Can we show the map, just to show what America looked like?
And the speed with which it happens is quite mind-boggling, actually. Are we able to bring up the map? Do we?
I won't go into a huge, long geography lesson.
Okay.
But it's because I did not know this. So the dark part of the map, this is in 1836, which is the year my book starts. The dark bits, those were the United States of America. So it's about a third of the size that it is now. The far west, the palest bit, which is now the whole of the Southwest, so California, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, all part of Mexico. It wasn't America at all. The northern part of that, Oregon, what was known as Oregon country, was disputed land between Great Britain and the US. No, I mean, it goes without saying there were Native American tribes living there to whom it really belonged, but the kind of, the power struggle over who was going to own this land hadn't been settled. And the grey bit in between was known as Indian Territory. So it was kind of notionally part of the States. It had been sold by Napoleon under the Louisiana Purchase, roamed over by about 250,000 Native Americans in about 300 different tribes, and these vast herds of bison, buffalo. 30 million of these animals in these huge herds of about 100,000 animals strong. I mean, one of the great wonders of the world. So remember those figures. So when the first women went west, and you can see the dotted line going from what was the frontier, roughly speaking, along the Missouri River, that whole of that dotted line, nearly 2,500 miles, they had to get passports to go there because it wasn't part of the States. And could we have the second photograph, the second person?
Just as we do, so what was the legal status of the so-called Indian Territory?
Well, technically it was part of the United States, but to be honest, it was a sort of imperial fantasy of the United States. This was an area lived in by all these Native American tribes who controlled that area. They hunted. They were mostly hunter-gatherers. They lived there. Very, very few white people had ever really been to that area. No white women had been to that area. It was considered impossible journey for white women to do. So, I don't know, to say that the United States owned it, I find it's
sort of
that's
meaningless,
a very,
isn't
really
it?
problematic thing to actually say. But let's put it like this. The US government believed that it owned that area. It was also called unorganized territory, by the way. Indian Territory or unorganized territory, meaning that at some point they were going to get round to organizing it into states. And if you look at this map, this was in 1880. That's within 40 years. If you remember, the tiny area in the dark grey on the east, 40 years later, that was what America looked like. And that tiny little blob in the middle that says Indian Territory, it's now Oklahoma, that was all that remained of Indian Territory. It had been completely colonized by these settlers who went, in huge, great waves every year, in increasing numbers every year.
And it's exponential, isn't it? It starts with a trickle, and then year on year, it just explodes. I mean, the numbers are staggering. Just tell us again, in 40 years, how many people...
Okay, so in 1836, the year that my book starts, I start with that year because that was the year that the first two white women, two Presbyterian missionary women called Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spaulding, they were on their way to convert, save two Native American tribes in what is now Oregon, the two ladies who needed a passport to get there. That was 1836. No one thought it could be done. When they survived this truly tough, epic journey, 2 years later, 4 missionary women made the same journey, and they also survived. And so this kind of opened the gateway, if you like. People then thought, well, if they can do it, we can do it too. 1840, one family left the Missouri River and made the journey to Oregon, a woman called Mary Walker, her 3 children, and she was also pregnant at the time. Extraordinary.
So initially, the things that drive it are missionary zeal.
Missionary zeal to start off with, then it becomes more complicated. But just to give you an idea of the numbers, so 4 missionaries, 1841 family, 1841 100 people, 1842 200 people, 1843 1,000 people, 1848 gold is discovered in California. So the following year, 30,000 people made the journey. The year after that, 50,000 people made the journey.
Gold was even more popular than Jesus.
So off they yes, absolutely.
Yes.
They went. Then the stagecoach in the mid-50s reduced this journey from upwards of 5 or 6 months to 3 weeks. Then the Pony Express was started in 1861. That meant you could send messages. It took 10 days, I think, to send messages. That only lasted a year and a half because the year after that, telegraph poles had been erected coast to coast, so there was no need for these relays of men. And in 1869, that's less than 30 years, less than 40 years after the first people set off, the transcontinental railway had been completed, and the 6-month journey could be done in less than a week. So at that point, millions more people crammed into those areas, those central, the areas kind of beyond the Midwest onto the Great Plains. So it was so fast. It was absolutely, like, in terms of world history, it was just in the blink of an eye.
I had to sort of go back and reread those data, because it's an extraordinary migration. It's a huge migration that people don't really kind of. It hasn't been described in those terms that I've seen. I've forgotten what my next question was. I wanted to move to the characters. You'll have obviously favourites. We all pretend not to, but there will have been people that popped out for you. But before we sort of look at the individual women, there were some very hilarious tales of the way that it was sold. It was pitched to people. They were sort of advertisements, if you like, of, oh, come west. There's the pigs run around with the knife and fork already in them. There's something bizarre, like there's the way that they would lure people to travel west. How was that sort of packaged up for prospective travellers?
As you said, first of all, it was Jesus. It was a missionary zeal that made people go west. But then, really, it was about economic prosperity. There was a depression in the U.S. in the 1830s, so lots of farmers particularly lost their land and their livelihood. So they wanted cheap or very free, free or really cheap land. And Oregon in particular was kind of, there was this thing called Oregon fever. So we all know about gold fever. When people heard about the gold, they all went absolutely mad and left. But predating gold fever was this thing, Oregon fever. So Oregon, there were these Oregon societies, and Oregon was held up as this land of milk and honey, and it was early advertising. What Bee was saying in one of them, it was, the pigs run around already roasted, with a knife and fork in them. I mean, it was kind of a joke, but only just a joke. You dropped your seed onto the bare land and the crops would just spring up. It never really rained. The water felt like gentle dew. There was no sickness. It was like a parrot. It was sold to these settlers as a kind of paradisical place where anything was possible. And everyone admitted to the detail, which was that there were actually quite a number of Native American tribes already living there, and it was sold as this empty, an empty wilderness where anyone could go if they had the kind of, if they had the grit to be able to make this journey. And that's why these people started to
the journey is gritty. The journeys are.
The journey was truly gritty. So I'll put my cards on the table. My sympathies are almost entirely with the Native Americans whose way of life was destroyed by this act of colonization, really. I don't think Americans really, rather in the same way that in Britain, we're coming to terms with our imperialist history, I think in America they also should be coming to terms with exactly
genocide. Let's call it what it is. It's genocide. Well, we are coming to that.
Well, let's come to that, because it's more complicated than that. Where was I? I was about the journey.
So horrific journeys and the characters that emerge from that.
Horrific journeys, in horrible weather. So either dust that choked them or flash floods that swept away their whole caravans. I came across this absolutely appalling description of a woman who started to give birth in the middle of a flash flood in the middle of the prairie. Because, of course, pregnancy was not considered any reason not to embark on this journey. No one talked about it. It was such a taboo that women didn't really mention the fact that they might be pregnant. So that was not considered a reason maybe to leave it until the following year to go. No, off they went. So anyway, this woman in the middle of a flood went into labour, and there's this dreadful description of her with her female friends, no doctors anywhere nearby, obviously, her female friends rallying round with their skirts hitched up to their knees in this water, and this poor woman, this poor labouring woman, all they could do was get 2 chairs and put this woman on top of the chairs to stop her being, as the baby was delivered. They got lost, they didn't know where they were going, they had no maps in the very early days. As one settler put it, they had to smell their way west.
This comes out of letters, doesn't it?
Yes.
They're writing letters and diaries.
Letters
so you
and
get
diaries,
these sort of
a lot of
everyday details.
A lot of them wrote accounts while they were actually en route. So, as Bee was saying earlier, one of the things that's, as a historian working in women's history, it's incredibly well documented. I think there are 2,000, just over 2,500 known accounts of what were called the westward journeys, and about a third of them are by women, which is an incredibly high proportion. That's much higher proportion of sort of female testimony than you would normally get. And some of them are very middle-class women. They're rather literary accounts, but others are, actually my favorite ones are the ones by women who were much more, much sort of farmers' wives. So they were literate, but only just. And so their accounts are fantastic. They're total streams of consciousness. So there's no punctuation. There are no capital letters. It's just, I think there's one particular woman, Keturah Belknap she was called, and she kept this memorandum every day of her life from when she was 15. And I think she rode on the front of her wagon and she literally wrote it as she was experiencing it. And she wrote it as she speaks. So you can sort of hear her voice in your head, and she describes exactly.
She's got a real eye for detail. I recall that she's a fan
yeah.
of the crisp white tablecloth.
Yes,
there's just these lovely details that emerge.
A very proud housewife.
There's an interesting echo of your previous work that I was lucky enough to interview you about at this very festival, She Merchants, Buccaneers and Gentlewomen, which is the story of women that travelled to India in the 17th century. And there's a curious echo that at that stage, white people coming here would intermarry, would be curious and open to local customs, probably deeply racist too, but we hadn't tipped over into the really bad stuff. And there's an echo of that here, the early people coming, certainly amongst the trappers and people that would come through, that they would marry and mingle with native people.
Very similar to East India Company merchants with their BBs, but so before women started to go in these migrations, mid-19th century migrations, very few white Americans had really been to the lands west of the frontier, which was the Missouri River, except for these people rather wonderfully known as mountain men. So they were the fur traders and trappers, and they routinely married Native American women. But what's interesting about them, and a bit different from the idea of the East India Company merchants and their BBs, is that it was the mountain men, the advantages were all on their side. These were strategic marriages that they made. They were called country marriages, so there was no church involved, there was no paper, there was no bureaucracy involved. So they were not, in terms of the white Americans, they weren't kind of legal marriages, but they were pretty solid de facto marriages in the field. And they were strategic, as in if a man married a woman of a certain tribe, he would then be treated like kin, and he would then be able to have kind of free range over those particular lands which were dominated by that particular tribe. So the advantages were all with the man. Mm. And obviously they were, it was for companionship in the wild and things like that. But sometimes, can I just tell one story, which is one of my favorite stories? So often these were marriages that were useful to both sides because they were living quite a rough life in the wilderness. The trappers were trapping, mink and beaver was the big thing that they all wanted. But occasionally you get women who were often mixed race, so they would be the daughters of high-standing fur company officials and Native American wives. And these women were of particularly high status. Everybody wanted to have a woman like this. And the two missionary women who went across, the first two white women to make this journey, who talk in a rather, in a way that is very, repulsive actually to us today. They talk about Native Americans as being savages and, the benighted heathen who they, as the great white people, were going to go and save, quote unquote. And they get to this place, Fort Vancouver, which is right up in the very far Pacific Northwest, and they get, and the woman who is the first lady of Fort Vancouver, so the woman of the highest status in this quite substantial community, was half Cree, so she was a half mixed race. She was half white and half Cree, and she completely exploded this woman's ideas of what a savage Native American was, because she was totally high status. She lived in a very fancy house, much grander house than anything they had. She had a beautiful mahogany table. She had her husband's family silver that she used. And she gave, the best detail that I found was she gave these two women, these very superior Presbyterian missionaries, a lesson in local etiquette, which must have really surprised them. So Narcissa Whitman was going to write a letter home to her mother, and she was about to, this would have gone by sea, she was about to seal the letter with a wafer. So she was about to lick this wafer to seal down the two bits of paper. And just as she was about to do this, this lady I'm talking about was called Marguerite McLaughlin. Her husband was a guy from the Orkney Islands, so she had his name. So Marguerite McLaughlin went to, no, well, my dear, you mustn't do that. It's terribly rude to send spittle to a friend. Here's the McLaughlin family crest and some sealing wax. This is how we do it here. And so she corrected her and said, "You uncivilized barbarian, how could you do that?" So I've always enjoyed that.
Back to the traders, the trappers, the mountain men, a sort of a whole industry. As the migration, this mass migration takes off, a whole industry builds up around this, and some of it is quite dark. One of the quotes I picked out about this sort of parasitic business models is they are as great a set of sharks as ever disgraced humanity. And this is the point at which it tips over in the narrative of the book into some very dark areas around the treatments of the indigenous people, to the extent that California gave an official state apology in 2019 for the genocide. Can you talk to us about the genocide? The Trail of Tears.
Yes. The Trail of Tears was in the East. It's complex because the United States is such a huge place. The tribes were of very varying degrees of power within themselves.
They're hugely diverse.
Hugely
they're not just
diverse. Hugely diverse. So the Plains tribes, the tribes who are you remember the so-called Indian Territory, that large area which is the Great Plains, they had horses and weapons, and they were powerful, and they kept at bay the US Army for quite an impressive length of time. So I don't want to present all Native Americans as kind of victims who were just, killed by the settlers going across, because it wasn't necessarily that way. And particularly the Trainsflies were ferociously great warriors, and they fought back against this tide of this white invasion, which it really was, once they realized that it wasn't just a few people who they could trade with. So that was one situation. But the much more, it didn't end well for them either, because by 1890, I should have said by 1880, the frontier had gone, and by 1890, this is the most awful figure, there were no Native Americans living freely on their own lands. They'd all been forced into reservations, and all the bison were dead. They were hunted to oblivion, to complete extinction. We might come up onto that later on. But I just wanted to say, in California, it was different because the tribes were much smaller in number. There were more tribes with fewer people. They were less warlike. And particularly when the people went looking for gold, they often went in groups, militias, they were bristling with weaponry. This was the American, gold diggers who went. A lot of them went from Oregon down. Some of them came across the States, and they just annihilated these small tribes. They would go into villages, and they would just, if a tribe's an indigenous person, for example, if they thought that they'd taken a cow or a steer from one of the white people coming in, they would just go after the entire village. And there are awful stories of these militias going in and just wiping out a whole village, men, women and children, old people, everything. And in California, it is technically a genocide in California.
The figure that I've got here is that the population goes from 150,000 to 30,000.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
So it's quite staggering. So it's set against the background. So the US has come through its civil war, so 1861 to 65. Yes. Then there's the war with Mexico. So they've got these things going on, and then what happens at this point is, this is your phrase, an all-out state-sanctioned violence. And it really is an extraordinary chapter. One of the other narrative threads that comes through this is the issue around slavery and people that have escaped slavery and the race issue and the character of Biddy Mason, who we have to meet.
I was hoping you were going to ask me about Biddy Mason. So, you know, I was saying earlier, the kind of Hollywood version of the Wild West is very white and very male, but also very white. And of course, there were many black Americans who also took part in these migrations. And some of them were free men and women from the East, who also, you know, free is a very relative term. They were escaping from what one black historian calls a state of unfreedom in the East. So they also went east in these yearly migrations. But so they were volunteers on this thing, but they were also, this was before the Civil War, so before the 1861, there were many black enslaved people who were forcibly taken along these migration routes. I think in some cases the people who held them were, told them that they had to do this appalling journey, but they would be free once they got the other end, which was sometimes the case, but more often not the case. Both Oregon and California, by the way, were founded as free states, so technically that was the case. Biddy Mason, it's quite a complicated story, so I will try.
I'm going to make you condense it because we've still got to get to
I'm going to condense it. So Biddy Mason was taken west with her family. They were Mormons. They ended up in California, where technically Biddy should have been free. They refused to free her. So a recently freed black ranch owner, whose son wanted to marry one of Biddy's daughters, went to the local sheriff and got a writ of habeas corpus and raced in saying, you mustn't, you can't take this family. So the long and short of it was, Biddy Mason's case, she had 5 children, I think, went to court. The slave owners did everything to try to prevent her, they wanted to return east to Texas, where she was not going to possibly be free. He tried to kidnap her children, he threatened, he did everything, told lies. He eventually bribed the lawyer that had been found for these 2 black women. And so the lawyer took $100, which was a lot of money, and the case was dropped, so they were absolutely in deep trouble, because you couldn't, as a black person, give testimony against a white person in court, even though California was a free state. It didn't apply to the law. And so this judge, this wonderful judge, Benjamin Hayes, may his name be remembered forever, said, well, I can't try your case in court, but I'm going to hear your story in my private chambers. And so he took these 2 women, there was Hannah and her half-sister, and 13 children among them, took them into his private chambers and heard their story, out of the sort of, legal system. And he found in their favor, and he set them free, and she became one of the very first black African Americans women to be a property owner in Los Angeles.
She was a really big entrepreneur. There's a mural to her today in LA. It's really cool.
So it's a good success story. They didn't all end like that way, but this is a good story.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary character. The environmental impact is also incredibly shocking, and it's not just the buffalo herds. What's a fur desert?
So the white involvement in the West was initially all to do with the fur trade. And I think you're talking about so there was American fur companies and there were British fur companies. So Fort Vancouver, this place where the missionary women ended up, was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, which was a British company, and they practiced this policy of, what was it called? Desert. Basically deliberately trapping all the animals to extinction.
Just annihilating an entire species.
So that their American competitors couldn't have the fur. So the beaver was hunted practically to the point of extinction. Beaver was used, by the way, in the making of men's top hats back in Europe. Beaver fur, I think it was there was a way of making it into a pulp, and then finally they found a way to make top hats out of silk. And so the beaver trade, there were no beavers left by that point. The beaver trade collapsed because there wasn't.
And then, of course, the great tragedy of the buffalo herds that are seen by Elizabeth Custer of General Custer fame through her opera glasses. She describes this scene. Tell us what happens to the buffalo.
Is
buffalo the same as bison?
Bison, buffalo, yes, it's interchangeable. They referred to as both things. So I was saying at the beginning, there were these extraordinary herds, 100,000 animals strong. I mean, that is an enormous number. And people would describe how the whole ground would tremble with the if you saw a herd going past, the entire ground would tremble. They could be, something like a mile long, these herds. I mean, they were absolutely vast herds. And that was one of the great sights of the very early journeys that were made. And there was a trade in buffalo hides always. Native American power but depended quite often on the sale of these hides, so they did hunt buffalo. But buffalo also, they had a spiritual connection with the buffalo. No part of the buffalo was ever wasted, and obviously they didn't shoot very many. There were 30 million of these animals, so what they hunted was not, they hunted very consciously. That wasn't going to make a dent in the population numbers. But what really did for the bison was when the Transcontinental Railway was completed, because then instead of it for white hunters, instead of it having to be a great expedition of many months long, you could take your gun on the train, and Elizabeth Custer has a rather awful description of how the engine driver would pull his, the sound on the kind of horn on the train as when he saw a herd come past, and every man on the train would get their gun and would just point their gun out of the window and just randomly shoot into these herds, because it was a trophy thing. Everyone wanted to say that they'd shot a buffalo. And then you got professional buffalo hunters coming along who just wiped out these huge herds. And there are awful photographs of these piles of bones. I don't know if any of you have seen them. I mean, piles of bones which were higher than like twice the height of a man. So, 12, 15 foot high piles just of the skulls of these bisons. And the robes, so the skins would be shipped east because they were very fashionable, and these rotting carcasses would just be left on the prairie. So, and this is the thing that
there's so much heartbreak. There's so much heartbreak in this story.
Is that instead of it being this beautiful, pristine wilderness, that the prairie was covered with this putrid, stinking, rotting mass. And by the 1870s, actually, these huge herds were actually extinct. And this is the reason that so many of these Native Americans were forced onto the reservations. It wasn't because they had lost in battle, although that was part of the reason. It was because there was no food left for them. So these people who depended on their buffalo hunts, there were no buffaloes left to hunt, and the reservations came with annuities attached to them. So, if you go and live on your reservation, we will give you a yearly annuity, basically like the doling out food. And so the Cheyenne, for example, the Arapaho, the various different tribes of the Lakota, all the Native American tribes from the Central Plains, most of them ended up in reservations because they were starving and they had that was the only place they could get food. So they are brutal. It's a brutal story.
And as you say at the very beginning, the work that you've done, the research that you've done has led you to these extraordinarily dark parts of North American history that aren't that well known.
It.
I'd like to sort of step back from that whole narrative, though. Are you telling me to stop, or that we've got 10 minutes? 10 minutes, right? Okay. Do get your questions ready.
So fast.
I'd like to sort of get a unifying thought, if I may, just before we go to questions, which is that you've done, and this is true of your previous work. Indeed, this is your terminology. A group biography. I love this. Taking women who have been sort of rendered invisible for whatever reason, and taking their stories, their letters, it's a hard job of work, and creating something out of that. And there's a quote that stood out for me that I'm just going to very quickly read. Having no political power and no public voice, in the past, women have stood obliquely to what are thought of as the great moments of history: treaties, war, government, and tribal negotiations. The moments that usually make it into the history books. And yet, it is precisely because of this that they are important, because they're bearing witness. And these are the prism of the incredible stories that you've just told. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
I hope we don't feel that we've missed anything, but we probably
you.
should go to questions if
Yes,
we've got time.
absolutely,
Somebody
yes.
here. Anybody else? Keep your hand up, please.
My question to you is, does being a historian almost means like being a time traveler, because you are able to say so confidently about all the years that you mentioned and the stories that you were paving, that I honestly felt that I'm imagining those journeys. So what would you like to say on that?
So the question is, it's so creative and so imaginative. It's like being a time traveller, and that's very much the experience of reading it. You're quite right. How do you feel about being a time traveller?
Oh, well, I think that's such a wonderful description. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's lovely. I mean, yes, the thing about these accounts is that they are so vivid, and they describe the kind of, they're not talking about treaties and battles and, like I said, the things that usually make it into the history books. They're talking about what it was actually like to be there, what happened when they got cold, what happened when their children got sick. How did they relieve themselves when there was no privacy? And there's a great description of these women. They would all stand in a circle and hold up their skirts, and somebody would go in the middle to give, because there was nothing on the prairies, to give them a bit of privacy. So those are the details that I love and latch onto, because those are the things that brought it alive to me. And that's what I try to do in the book, is try to make it as trying to make the sort of what I call the what they ate for breakfast factor, because that's what we want to know, isn't it?
True.
We want to know.
It's true.
What it was like.
It's a very Katie Hickman detail, actually, that some of the lists of the things is so poignant. The things that people believe that they need when they're setting off on these long journeys is really poignant. And then, of course, they have to dump it all because they get stuck in a pile of mud or a snow drift. And there was one guy that sort of cries because he has to leave his mother's rolling pin behind.
Right.
So it's these details that make you think, you're there. Another question, please. Here.
Hi, it was a lovely session, and I wanted to ask you, what was your research process like for this work, and how long was your research?
Well, thank you. So how long was the research? It took me a year, more than a year, to research. I could be researching it for, the next decade, to be honest, because there's so much. But so I said a year, and then I'll start writing. And I did a road trip in the States. There are two main westward trails. One is to Oregon and one is to California. So I did a road trip and I traveled the California trail so that I could see for myself what it was like. But actually, the written sources amazingly were all in the British Library, and I live in London, so I spent a happy year in the British Library until lockdown happened, and then I had to buy them on Amazon because I couldn't get into the British Library. But luckily, I'd almost finished by that point. And they're so scattered around, they're in archives all over America. So if I couldn't have done this book, it would have been a very difficult book to have done without access to the British Library, and without access to the internet, where all the I used a lot of things like the Oregon Society has a bulletin every month going back to the 1910, 1911, 1912, and it's all online. So I was able to access those. If I'd have to do the legwork around the States, I don't think I could have done it, or I wouldn't have done the book that I have done.
Okay.
So thank you for that.
Any other burning questions? We've got a very tiny amount of time left. No. So Katie Hickman's book, Bravehearted, has sold out. It's sold out. Does anyone here have a copy? Maybe they could sell it for double the price. I don't know. If you've got a copy and you'd like to have it signed by Katie, or if you have any further questions for Katie, are you happy to hang out for a bit?
Absolutely, I would love that. Yes.
But in the meantime, we'll wrap up now. But a huge round of applause for Katie and her wonderful
Thank
book,
you.
Bravehearted.
Thank you, my darling.